Welcome to our second episode of What Once Was, a series based on what the railroads of North Louisiana once looked like and how they operated back in previous years. In today's episode, we are once again focusing on F-unit locomotives, but this time, the few that were included in the Louisiana and Northwest Railroad's roster. Before the days of Patriot Rail corporate imagery inserted in just about every possible aspect of the L&W, it was a popular target not only for rail fans in the region, but on a national scale. What made the L&W such a popular destination, you ask? Well, I'm willing to bet that most would agree that it was their fleet of F units that pulled freight well after most major railroads retired them out of revenue service. Some of these units would remain on the L&W property in Gippsland well into the 1990s. Although they were eventually phased out by early GP locomotives, their time on the L&W was the pinnacle of the popularity of the railroad and are still talked about to this day. In today's video, we are going to be overviewing each F unit and go over their history and where the survivors are now. The Louisiana Northwest rostered 6 total F units, 5 of which were standard F7As, while 1 was an FP7A. The L&W numbered them 44 through number 49. Let's begin with the first of the half dozen F units. Number 44 was an EMD F7 locomotive built on July of 1952. It was originally built for the Southern Pacific Railroad as number 6379. After serving the SP for about 18 years, the F7 was relieved of duty and sent to General Electric as a trade-in. In return, this would help with the order of U-30Cs SP had placed. Now, usually this unit would have been scrapped by GE, but instead, they sold it to the Louisiana Northwest in October of 1968, where it would work until the 1980s. The model train manufacturer Bowser actually released several HO scale F units in the famous red and yellow paint, and you'll notice that 44 will not have a logo on the model. But rest assured, the now retired railroader who actually painted the L&W F units gave them a call to let them know what was missing. After observing this error, the Bowser employee remarked that the logo did look a little funny. Well, that's because it was hand-painted rather than being applied on a decal. I imagine that the Bowser employee got an absolute kick out of that, and that's still one of the best stories I've ever heard. After being retired in the 1980s, number 44 would be purchased by Entertainment Trains to serve as power for the Galveston to Houston passenger excursion train known as the Texas Limited. After operations of the Limited ceased, it was donated to the Galveston Railroad Museum. It would stay there on display until Hurricane Ike would severely damage the former 44, and unfortunately just a few years later, it would be scrapped. Number 45 was built as a SP6380 in the same month and year as number 44. Like the rest of the F units, instead of heading straight for the L&W from GE, it actually went to the sister railroad of the L&W, known as the WAG. There, the number 45 was numbered 2000. And it wouldn't be much longer after that before operations on the WAG would cease and 2000 would be sent to the L&W to be renumbered to 45. Even after being retired by the L&W in the 80s, 45 would sit behind the engine shops until at least 1999, I believe, before being sent to its new owner. The Niles Canyon Railroad Museum purchased it along with the 46. To this day, both of the F7s await their eventual restoration, hopefully in the state of California. Like I just mentioned, the 46 is also at the Niles Canyon Museum. 46 basically shares the same history as 45, built in 52 for SP, sent to the WAG, and then to the L&W, and then onto the museum in California. It's also worth mentioning that both of these units are still sitting there in L&W paint. Number 47, also built by the Southern Pacific, but this time it was built 2 years before the previous units as number 6309. Like its sisters, it was sent to the WAG before being transferred to the L&W. 47 was actually the second F unit that powered the Texas Limited back in Galveston, and regrettably, it would be met with the same scrapper's torch a few years after the hurricane severely damaged it. Number 48 was built for the Texas and New Orleans Railroad in October 1953 as number 379. Like all of the others, it was sent to the WAG before arriving to Louisiana. It was bought in the early 90s by the Waccamaw Coastline Short Line in South Carolina. Although it would continue freight service there for a few years, it would eventually be retired for a third time. Now, I'm not entirely certain on the fate of this one. I've seen a few sources saying it has been scrapped there, but also some saying it still sits somewhere in a shed or something in South Carolina. If anyone in the area knows the definitive answer, please share down in the comments below. And for our grand finale, we have the only F unit that wasn't a standard F7, number 49. The only FP7 to ever serve on the roster was built in January 1950 for the Western Pacific as number 805A. It pulled passenger trains across the system, including the iconic California Zephyr. It was then sold to the WAG in the early 70s and was later sent to the L&NW a few years later. In 1986, it was sold to the Western Pacific Railroad Museum in California, where it would be repainted into its original California Zephyr orange and silver paint. As far as I know, it is still operational there, but it mainly has sat as a cosmetic display for the last few years. And that, my friends, wraps it up for this video on the history and overview of the F-Unit fleet of the Louisiana Northwest Railroad. While I never saw them operating, I still have a fondness for these units that once roamed north and south on my humble hometown railroad. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like down below, and as always, thanks for watching. And also, huge thanks to Mr. Moe's Cruise for supplying the pictures.